Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Ladies and gentlemen, our program will begin in just a moment. Good day. Welcome to Advocacy Anywhere, powered by AJC. Advocacy Anywhere is AJC's digital platform that enables you to engage with AJC's global expertise, content, and advocacy from wherever you are. Today's program is brought to you in partnership with Jewish Insider. You can sign up for Jewish Insider's daily kickoff by visiting jewishinsider.com. We are delighted to be joined today by Margaritis Schinas, Vice President of the European Commission and European Commissioner for Promoting the European Way of Life, to discuss issues related to European anti-Semitism, health, migration and asylum, the EU fight against terrorism and radicalization, and more. Vice President Schinas will be in conversation with AJC CEO David Harris. After we hear from Vice President Schinas and David, we will take your questions. You may email your questions to questions@ajc.org. Questions is plural. David, you and our esteemed guest have the floor.
Julian, thank you very much, and hello to our American and our worldwide audience. It gives me a very special pleasure to be together in conversation today with my friend Margaritis Schinas, who is, as Julian said, the Vice President of the European Commission. And we'll get in just a moment to exactly what the Commission is and exactly what portfolios Mr. Schinas has. But I was together with Margaritis as recently as February, pre-pandemic, when AJC hosted a panel at the prestigious Munich Security Conference. And he and the noted Washington Post columnist and author Ann Applebaum and I shared a stage moderated by our own Alan Rich. And before that, in December, he had just taken office with the new slate of EU commissioners, and so graciously made time for my colleague Daniel Schwalmenthal, who runs our Transatlantic Institute in Brussels, and me to come by and to sit with him and to sit with his deputy and another dear friend, Katarina von Schnurbein, who is the point person within the Commission and reporting to Vice President Schinas on the issue of anti-Semitism. So it's in that spirit, Margaritis, that I welcome you to this AJC audience. First of all, welcome.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
So let's begin. There are some people on this call I know who are pros, who could probably write a PhD on the European Union structure. And there are others who are quite new, the Commission, the Council, the Parliament. So let's begin at the beginning. Explain for those who are new to the EU structure what the Commission is and how you fit into it.
The Commission is the executive arm of the European Union and has mainly three functions. First, has the monopoly of initiating policy at the European level. It is only the Commission that can trigger a proposal that would become legislation at the EU level. That's our first job. The second function is, of course, that we are the guardians of the treaties. That means that we are the ones who have to make sure that all legislation and fundamental texts that govern the European Union are properly implemented and applied in our member states. And thirdly, we are the ones who manage the European Union budget, which is not that big as the US federal budget, but still is a substantial budget of approximately 150 billion euros per year. This is our job, this is what we do, and this is a political institution composed of 27 commissioners, each being appointed by one of our constituent member states.
So Margaritis, you were nominated and appointed by our good friend, Prime Minister Mitsotakis of Greece. You succeeded another good friend of AJC, Dimitris Avramopoulos, but you have the title of Vice President. And as I look at your portfolio, it's massive. It begins with this kind of very intriguing notion of promoting the European way of life. And it goes from there. What exactly is the European way of life as it's understood in the Commission?
Well, you rightly point out that this is the first vice president from Greece, so there is a historic element in all this, and which is very flattering for me, because Greece has been member of the European Union for 40 years, and I have the great privilege to be the first vice president in the Commission from Greece. But secondly, it's also an exciting job because it's a new job. This vice presidency did not exist in previous commissions, college formations, and it brings together two clusters of policies that are at the heart of the European project. To simplify, I would say the first cluster responds to what Emmanuel Macron described in his famous Sorbonne speech as the Europe that protects. This is the set of policies that are meant to offer our citizens the assurance that the European Union can be an additional shield other than the national protection systems in areas like security, migration, borders, health. So this is the first part of my job. And the second part of my job is what we could call a Europe that empowers, a Europe that opens up opportunities for its people, mainly in areas like mobility, skills, education, culture, youth, sport, everything that brings Europeans together beyond national borders. And there is a third element attached in my job, which is what brings us together, which is that the president entrusted also for the first time to a vice president the task to coordinate our work against anti-Semitism and the structured dialogue with the communities of faith and non-confessional organizations. So you're right in saying that this is a big job, but this is also a job that creates new opportunities at the European Union level. It needs some explanation because many people have a tendency to concentrate on the label rather than on the substance of it, but thank you for giving me the opportunity to do both.
Absolutely. So let's dive right in. Europe protects. Can we say today that Europe protects its Jewish communities and ensures that they have a future within the borders of the European Union? How do you feel about that?
First of all, I feel a particular responsibility about that. I do not want this notion of fight against anti-Semitism to become just a slogan or empty words. I feel it very deep inside as something that has to transcend, to translate into specific actions. And I have another thing that it is also very clear in my mind, that this is a particular historic burden on Europe's shoulders. Anti-Semitism is not only European, of course, but one cannot neglect, deny that Europe has a specific responsibility, transcends from history, to get this right. And the way of implementing action and policy to live up to this challenge should not be a single track. I see it as a multi-dimensional equation that brings together different strands of work. First, security, physical security for Jewish communities in Europe. This is vitally important. Jews have to feel safe in Europe as everybody else. Second, fighting against hate speech, stereotypes, disinformation, fake news, that's equally important. Third, work with the instruments we've got now, like the definition of anti-Semitism and the European Council Declaration of 2018 that give us concrete tools. And finally, working with society, the press, the media on outreach. I think this is very important. We discussed this many times bilaterally, but I think there is a story to be told out there, and we have to tell it. We have to say it. We have to come out very forcefully. This year was a difficult year, but the Auschwitz celebrations, the commemorations rather, back in January, offered us an opportunity to claim this outreach work that needs to be done. This is vitally important. Not only action, not only policy, but also lots of explanation and lots of public debate.
So Margaritis, if I can personalize this for a moment, because you spoke about sort of Europe's special obligation. You yourself come from a city that is renowned in Jewish history, Thessaloniki, a city in northern Greece, which, if I'm not mistaken, lost roughly 96% of its pre-war population to the German occupation and the deportation to the camps. You grew up in a post-war Thessaloniki. Did you feel the absence of Jews? Was it something that you were conscious of? Because obviously you did not know the pre-war vibrancy of the Jewish community. How did that impact you?
For me, this is part of my upbringing. I like history. I've studied a lot. And of course, you are, again, right to say that in my generation, I didn't have many Jewish people in Thessaloniki, but the memories, the history, the few people who have survived and managed to make a life there, for me were very, very telling and present examples, not only of the immense suffering of the Greek Jews during the Holocaust, but also of what followed the Holocaust, because it is not often discussed that the trauma of those who made it and the difficulties in making a new start, the feeling of guilt that very often themselves suffered, these are not things that have to be explained to me. I know them because, as you say, Thessaloniki is also known as the mother of Israel, and I'm very positively surprised by the work of the previous mayor, Yannis Boutaris, who, as you know, led a great project of the museum there and a major effort of outreach to bring back second and third generation Greek Jews back to the city of their ancestors. So yes, this is something that is very present in me. I'm not sure that Ursula von der Leyen knew it when she was giving me this responsibility, but certainly it helps me in doing my job.
So for our listeners, Ursula von der Leyen is the president of the European Commission and the former defense minister of Germany, and also a good friend of AJC in the past. So coming to the present, Margaritis, do you feel in your role as vice president overseeing this portfolio that you have the tools necessary to do what you wish to do? And if not, what tools do you still require, do you believe?
You see, the Commission is a collegiate body. That's why we are often called the College of Commissioners. That means that all members of the Commission have, of course, a responsibility for certain policy areas, but other than promoting our own portfolio areas, we contribute with our votes and we fertilize with our views and positions the work of our colleagues. So this is a good thing, because in a vice presidency which is so extensive as it is the case with mine, I can rely to 5 commissioners who work directly with me in this area of responsibility. The Interior Affairs Commissioner, the Social Affairs Commissioner, the Health Commissioner, the Education, Culture and Youth Commissioner, so on and so forth. So I feel that I have the necessary level of support within the family of the cluster, but equally, this College of Commissioners, my colleagues from all member states, are particularly sensitive to this notion of European way of life and how we can bring together these elements of a Europe that protects and a Europe that opens up opportunities for its people. So well, I don't want to make now announcements. We are only 7-8 months into this new job. We have 4 years and a half. God willing to keep working. But yes, I feel that there is a good basis to take this work forward in the years to come.
You mentioned earlier hate speech as one of the elements that transmits anti-Semitism. You know very well that there's often a debate in Europe regarding the American First Amendment and the degree to which that complicates the response in Europe. How do you view the strategy for dealing with hate speech and the internet as a vehicle for promoting anti-Semitism?
Yes, we do not have the First Amendment as such in Europe, but we do have our constitutional principles and the freedom of expression that, of course, are present not only in the national constitutions, but also in the Charter of Fundamental Rights. Now, the key element in our work to address hate speech in the internet is, of course, the platforms. And okay, this is a transatlantic dialogue now, but you know that Europe has a different way of going around platforms than the US. And there is lots of work that we have done traditionally that showed the platforms that we can make a difference, from the right to be forgotten, from the landmark decisions of the European Court of Justice on privacy, on general data protection regulations. So Europe has done a lot to show the platforms the limits of what can be done through them. And I always like to say that when it comes to content and hate speech and disinformation and fake news, the platforms cannot claim that they are the equivalent of the postman in the 50s, where the postman was delivering letters without knowing what is in there. The platforms do know. The platforms know, and they can control, and they can help us. So I think we have made a start with a code of conduct that my predecessor, Dimitris Avramopoulos, my colleague, previous and now, Yara Yurova and others have negotiated with the platforms, which is a code of conduct that helped us a lot, because on the basis of these commitments, the platforms have been taking down this sort of material, anti-Semitism, radicalization, and now we are very actively working with them to continue this engagement, because we think that this is the only way to do it. The platforms need to assume the obligation and their responsibility in fighting hate speech, radicalization online. This cannot be done without them. And I think that we're confident that the European way of doing it will be proved more effective.
One last question on this subject, Margaritis, and I'd like to go on to immigration and security for a few moments. We began to see anti-Semitism emerging in Europe about 20 years ago, and we began to see it coming from 3 sources. And we identified those sources very early on. That is, we, AJC, the far right, with its classic neo-Nazi, the Golden Dawn in Greece and its equivalents elsewhere. The far left, which claimed to be anti-Semitic, but had a particular problem with the existence of only one nation on earth, Israel, and elements inside the growing Muslim population of Europe that brought with them a sort of jihadist mindset. Do you think that each of these 3 sources is being given adequate attention and a very unique, customized strategy, or is something being lost in the struggle?
Well, this is a very interesting question, and if I would say, it's both a substantial question, but it's also a tactical question on how one organizes the response to this, to the counter narrative. When it comes to the xenophobic political forces, which are at the same time Eurosceptic and Europhobic, I think there again, this is a particular responsibility for Europe to deal with it for a very simple reason, because twice in the last century, we had the chance here in Europe to see how this movie ends when these forces get the upper hand. We know.
Right.
And we know what happened. We know how this movie ended. The First World War in the cenotaphs in the Somme, and the Second World War in Auschwitz and Dachau. So Europe cannot allow itself to fail again on fighting these xenophobic, extremistic, populistic, Eurosceptic forces. Now, what's the best remedy to do it? What's the best bullet? I think, and this is probably something that pertains to all the other subgroups that you mentioned, that the best bullet is good policy. Only good policy and fair policy kills the xenophobic forces. Take the Golden Dawn. At the peak of the Greek crisis, the Golden Dawn was polling at 11% of the national vote. Was it because 11% of the Greeks were anti-Semites? No. Or Nazis? No. But that was because they were surfing on the wave of the crisis. Once Greece, with the help of Europe, left the crisis behind, in the last elections, the Golden Dawn polled 0.09%. So good policy is the best attack to these forces. Now, on the other segments of xenophobia and hate, I think good policy, of course, helps, but also a concept of constant education, discussion, outreach, reminding of our past, and pointing anyone to the need of peaceful coexistence, tolerance, and living together in a society of equals. This is what works. So I'm afraid my reply is more multi-level than your question.
No, I appreciate it. And to be continued, of course. Your predecessor, at least in one respect, Dimitris Avramopoulos, who had the portfolios for migration and citizenship, dealt with profound crises during his 5 years. You now have within your larger portfolio this question as well of migration. What is the situation today facing Europe? In particular, what is the situation with respect to Turkey and to Libya and to other sensitive countries that in a way have control on the spigot, that they turn on, they turn off? What can you share with our audience?
First of all, there is a difference between the time that you were referring to, 2015, 2016, where the collapse of Syria forced 1 million desperate people to basically crush Europe's entry gates and through the Aegean find themselves in Central Europe. This was a major crisis. It was a major, I would say, historic moment. And let's face it, it caught us unaware. Europe at the time did not have the policy tools and instruments to cope with a crisis of that magnitude. Because there was, let's face it, there was no EU migration and asylum policy at the time. We had a patchwork of regulatory solutions that were producing very different outcomes, and simply we couldn't face up to the responsibilities. Now we are in a much better situation for a number of reasons. First, because the Syrian problem is not sorted out, but how, in a way, it has been confined and we don't see massive movements there, but also because Europe gradually has developed more instruments. We now have more money. We can distinguish those applying for asylum for those who need to be returned. We have a European Border and Coast Guard modeled upon the US Coast Guard that helps our national police authorities to patrol our external borders. But we're not out of the woods yet. We still need to produce a holistic, comprehensive, single framework for EU migration and asylum. This is one of the major assignments that this new commission will have to produce. It's one of the most emblematic announcements of the president. And Turkey and Libya will be two very crucial central elements in this arrangement, because it is obvious that Europe cannot sort out the migration conundrum without having a working, solid relationship with two of our immediate neighbors, who in a way are also countries of transit to Europe. So, as you know, with Turkey, we had a framework agreement since 2016 that worked more or less, but we still feel that we haven't reached the necessary level of political understanding with Turkey to renew it and refresh it. Josep Borrell, our High Representative for Foreign Policy, is now actively engaged with his Turkish counterpart to make this happen. On Libya, no one is happy or proud with the situation in Libya, but I think that in Libya there is no interlocutor, as you probably know, for Europe to engage. They have a de facto civil war, so it's getting more and more complicated. But to cut a long story short, the European Union migration policy, the future one, would certainly have to have a very strong external dimension component with our immediate neighbors, but also the countries at the origin of the migratory flows, mainly in Africa, but also Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. It cannot work otherwise.
And how much internal cohesion is there in the EU today, Margaritis? I mean, all of us remember 2015, 2016, the tensions within the European Union over the allocation or allotment of migrants to some countries which absolutely categorically refused or made it as difficult as possible. Has anything changed in that respect, or is that internal division still present?
Together with my colleague, the Swedish commissioner who is in charge of internal policies, we have traveled all over Europe. We have consulted with all our member states at the European Parliament. We sense for the first time a certain, I don't want to say optimism, because this is going to be very complex and difficult negotiation, but we sense a certain positivity, if you like, because there is a growing perception in Europe that the European Union cannot fail twice on such an important task. And to avoid the failure that we had 2015-16, we now need to produce something which is fundamentally different, and something that in a way goes beyond the red lines of certain member states 5-6 years ago, when they refused to take the level of responsibility that they should have. So I see our proposal, our new, we call it EU Pact for Migration and Asylum, as a 3-story building. The first floor would be what we were discussing earlier, a very strong external dimension, relationships with the countries of origin and transit, making sure that we work both at the origin of the migratory routes, but also at the transit routes. The second floor would be a robust system of management of our external borders through the European Border and Coast Guard, but also through a crisis mechanism that would allow us to very quickly support our frontline member states, as was the case with Greece in the beginning of the March. And the third and more important floor, which will only exist if the first and the second floor are solid, would be solidarity and burden sharing. We need a system where all 27 share the burdens of asylum and migration, not like now. It's totally unfair that 5 or 6 member states at the first reception shoulder a disproportionate level of responsibility on behalf of the other. So my hope is that by building this three-story building, we have more chances now than back in 2015.
Well, thank you. Let me, if I may, just press you a little bit more on Greece's neighbor, Turkey, because I needn't tell you, a Greek politician, how challenging a neighbor Turkey can be, both for Greece and for the European Union, and how it has used, at least this is our perception, correct me if I'm wrong, the migration issue at times as a political tool vis-a-vis both Greece and Europe more generally. Do you think that there is today a common understanding in Europe of what policy for Turkey should look like?
That's also a very pertinent and timely question. I think that there are lights and shadows in this EU-Turkey relationship. There are different shades, if you like. First of all, there is something that we need to recognize to the Turks. It would be unfair if we wouldn't. That Turkey is today the biggest country, the country in the world. The host country that hosts the biggest number of refugees worldwide. They host around 4 million Syrians, okay, with Europe's money and Europe's support, but still, this is something that no one can take away from them. And this is the sort of responsibility that we should recognize them for. Now, having done that, one would have expected that this would be the paradigm that would govern our global relationship. Well, we were very surprised to see that this was not the case, because what happened in early March was like mind-blowing. It was unprecedented that about 20,000 poor people were instrumentalized, if not weaponized. They were put in the buses in Istanbul and ferried to the Greek border with a perception that, you know, stay here and then you will go to Berlin tomorrow. So this is, we discussed it here many times. There's no explanation about it. It defeats the purpose, and it actually runs counter the arguments of those who want to help Turkey become a responsible partner in managing migration. So now that we left all this behind and we proved that both Greece and the European Union can protect the external border, I think now is the moment to engage with Turkey and to try to make the best of their cooperation. Of course, you know that they have all sorts of projects in Idlib, in Syria, in Libya, which does not facilitate things. But I think it's in the interest of the European Union to make them see that Turkey has more to gain, much more to gain, by engaging with the European Union in managing these problems rather than fighting the European Union. Migration, security, intelligence, these are areas of common interest where I think we could work together.
Margaritis, I'm going to ask you just one last question, if I may, which is a heads up to you, Julian, to please begin to look at our questions from our audience. I have 100 more questions, but I'll limit it just to one. Migration is only one step in a process that ultimately leads, at least in theory, hopefully in practice, to integration, to acculturation. Whether it's in the United States, which is a traditional immigrant receiving country, or Europe, which is increasingly an immigrant receiving continent. Do you see the pathways to full integration, if you will, to promoting the European way of life, even against the backdrop of some evidence of what are being called parallel societies? By the way, including not very far from where you're sitting right now, in Malbik, in Brussels, or in Malmo in Sweden, or in some of the banlieue, the suburbs of Paris. We've seen the creation of parallel societies which don't necessarily offer a very bright pathway to integration. Do you see strategies for overcoming whatever separation or parallel societies have emerged?
Well, the starting point for this debate is the fundamental premise that in Europe or the European Union will always be an asylum destination. So if someone needs protection according to international law, Europe will always be a destination for asylum seekers. This is what defines us. This is what made Europe in many possible ways. So this is clear, and we will keep and engage with this fundamental principle. At the same time, anyone who is not entitled to Europe's protection, anyone who has no legal reasons or cannot claim to be suitable or eligible for Europe's protection would simply need to go back. And I think this is something that these returns and readmissions, something that we failed to do in the past, but now this will be a very strong component of our new holistic migration framework. Now, having said this, there is another question which is an elephant in the room, which is integration. And this concerns, of course, not only those who are given asylum status and are, how should we call them, new Europeans that join our societies, that they have to contribute to our job market, they have to contribute to our social security systems, but also a number of people, increasingly these last years, of legal migration that we bring into the European Union for very specific job entitlements or through resettlement. Okay, this is not the blue card, the green card system that you have in the States, but it's a first step for legal migration. So the ones who are legally with us, be it through asylum or through these legal migration systems, should have all the rights, but also all the obligations of the societies that host them. This is part of the European way of life. And on many occasions, this means that they would have to make an effort. They would have to learn the language, they would have to understand society, they would have to invest in the host structures. And one should not forget that integration is always local. You always integrate to a local community. You do not integrate to a state or to a capital. So we have, you have to make sure that you address the integration elements and prerequisites at the local level. And let's face it, we were not very good at it in the past. Some of the areas that you mentioned are precisely the reminders of what didn't work in the past. Because successive or previous governments and politicians failed to address the specific requisites of integration at a specific context. So we are very aware of these concerns, and this will be also part of our work in this new framework we're discussing.
And I would just add on a personal note, if I may, before Gillian, you take over, I became a citizen of the European Union just a few months ago, Margaritis, and of a member state, obviously, because of my father's particular European history. And when I asked at the ceremony for a booklet explaining my obligations and my responsibilities as a new citizen of a European member state, the look I got was one of complete surprise. And I, in turn, was surprised by the surprise. I believe, because my family were all migrants, my mother, my father, my wife, that there's a social contract. It's a two-way contract. And I wanted to know what my responsibilities are, and I'm still trying to understand them. So having said that, Gillian, your turn, please.
Thank you, David. We're getting a lot of questions from our live audience. Our first question comes from Daria Weinstein in Berlin. Modern anti-Semitism often centers around Israel. The Jewish state is frequently demonized, and its very right to exist is challenged. Do you think there's more that the EU can do on this issue, and that it might help counter some of the hostility we see towards Jewish communities in Europe?
Israel is a key strategic partner of Europe. And we very highly value the cooperation that we have and the potential to increase it further. On economic cooperation, we have very strong relations, especially when it comes to research and development, but also to exchange programs, mobility programs, and we feel that there is a political gain for both sides. There is something else that I don't need to explain in particular, that Israel is probably the most European third country one can find outside the borders of the European Union. Probably Canada is another one. So the intensity and the depth of our cooperation is beyond any doubt. I think that if there were to be a matrix measuring the intensity and the commitment across the policy board between the EU and the third country, I'm sure that Israel would come at the top. Of course, this is not a surprise given the historical ties that bind our people together, but this is of course not all. This is not the end of the story. As in all strong relationships, both partners have to continue investing to keep searching for additional areas of cooperation. And of course, this major twin goal of the transition to a greener economy and to a more digital economy that is at the heart of the European Union political objectives, I'm sure that these are also areas where cooperation with Israel can flourish further.
Julian, could I step in for just a moment? Margaritis, one of the ideas that we at AJC have had, having been to Brussels countless times and hearing about climate change and the African continent as being very high on the minds of European leaders, is much deeper cooperation between the European Union and Israel vis-a-vis Africa. And in particular, taking some of the very viable Israeli solutions on water, on food production, on micro businesses, on startup mentality, and partnering with Europe, which is profoundly concerned about the impact of climate change and other forces on the African continent and what that can mean for Europe. Would you agree that this might be an area for deeper cooperation?
Absolutely. I think this is another example of what I was discussing earlier, that the strong relationship also compels us to look beyond strong relationship, what can be even stronger. And everything that pertains to these areas where Israel is a world leader would be greatly appreciated. As you know, the European Union is the largest, and its member states were the largest donor of development and investment aid in Africa. So we have a traditional connection to these economies, much older than the Chinese one, if I may say so. But everything that we can do to refresh it and fertilize it with ideas like the ones that you mentioned, I think would be greatly welcome.
We'll continue to pursue it. Thank you. Jillian?
Thank you. Our next question comes from Gerald Linsky in Sarasota, who says, in the last few weeks, we have seen terror attacks in the UK. What will be the degree of counterterrorism coordination with the UK now that the country is no longer an EU member state? And as a leader in counterterrorism efforts, is there a role for Israel to play here as well?
Well, on security, clearly the relationship with the United Kingdom would need to have a very strong security component. There is a difficulty now, as you know, that we are in the transition period where technically the United Kingdom is still part of our internal market arrangements, but as of the 1st of January will become officially a third country, and we're now negotiating the terms of our future relationship. What we're having now is mainly the result of another negotiation on an amicable divorce, but that's done. But as always the case after the divorce, one has also to build a new relationship. Unfortunately, these discussions have not yet materialized, have not succeeded yet. We are now actively discussing, and we will continue discussing throughout the summer. The idea is that by the 1st of January, we have to have this new EU-UK relationship, which would cover, of course, trade, key areas of cooperation, and I have no doubt that security cooperation would also have to be covered. I find it very difficult to believe that on such an important security player like the United Kingdom, we will fail to find functional arrangements for working together. Still, one has to be very clear that the fact that the United Kingdom would leave the European Union formally would, by definition, take the European Union out of our institutional structures and of our EU agencies that are specialized in this work. So there will be a gap, an institutional gap, if you like, but one that we should work to fill through practical arrangements.
Thank you. And just staying on security for a moment, we have another question from Tamara Goodman in Boston, who says she read last year that the EU saw some 120 foiled, failed, or completed terror attacks, most of them by Islamists. Can you assess trends of rising terror threats also from far right and or far left wing groups?
Yes, we have, I'm not sure how much I can say publicly on security. I suspect not much, but what I would like to say is that we are monitoring very closely the security patterns and terrorism, both at national level and through our EU agencies. There is an ongoing work where the European Union is acting like a catalyst, if you like, for cooperation between our agencies, the intelligence agencies. As you know, these agencies traditionally are not very known for sharing information beyond borders, but the nature of the terrorist threat in Europe requires us to coordinate and continue engaging with everybody. It would be wrong for the European Union to be to duplicate work done effectively at the national level, but we do have important tools and instruments to optimize the cooperation, the anti-terrorist cooperation, security cooperation, and intelligence cooperation between our governments. We also have a very effective Europol system, which is based in The Hague, as you know. So we are now building this single roof of security union that would have different rooms in this house, but we are confident that we can produce a single EU security union roof to address all these threats.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Alice Kublin in Washington, D.C., who asks, what does COVID-19 say about the EU's ability to deal with a global health crisis of this magnitude? And what do you think will be some lessons learned?
Yes, I think one has to be very open and sincere and have the courage as European to admit that the early response of our member states to the pandemic was not optimal. Most of our governments acted under the pressure of events and they took uncoordinated measures. So the early stage of the response was not good. And this became even worse because there was a gap of expectations where people were asking from Europe to do things in areas where Europe did not have the legal competence to act, like health policy, like education, tourism, and so on and so forth. Then we went through a second stage where our member states realized the level of interdependence that binds them together. We share the biggest internal market of the world, about 500 million consumers. So our supply chains are interlinked, our movements in the borders are interlinked, the way we go about trans-border care. So in this second stage, I think Europe managed to converge towards common solutions, and we started to change this early feeling of uncoordinated action. And now we are at the third and hopefully final stage of crisis management, which is the exit and the recovery element. What is important now is to move orderly and more coordinated into these post-confinement decisions, and at the same time activate important recovery tools that would kickstart the economy. And you probably are familiar with our unprecedented proposal for a recovery instrument of 700 billion euros that is meant for this purpose. So the main lessons to be drawn from the pandemic for Europe, I think, is that we have to increase our strategic autonomy in areas where the crisis proved us that we're rather poor, like purchasing personal protective equipment, ventilators, tomorrow vaccines. We need to build more resilience into our system, and we also need to bring more cohesion into our systems, make sure that nobody is left behind.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Beth Levine in Seattle. What is your assessment on the state of transatlantic relations and Europe's cooperation with the United States, both in regards to your portfolio specifically and more broadly?
Well, I was at the White House in my previous capacity as chief spokesman of the European Commission with President Juncker in July 2018 to meet President Trump and to build the foundations of a new transatlantic relationship. I think this was a meeting that went very well. We drafted a text, a joint declaration that is still valid and it still governs this new beginning, mainly to avoid any unilateral decisions that would create undue damage in terms of trade cooperation, but also opening up the European market in key American exports like LNG and soya beans. So there was this basis of a new beginning. I'm sorry to say that since then, progress was not noteworthy. Okay, things didn't go worse, but it didn't go well. It didn't go better either. So we had a stagnant view of transatlantic relations. I think it's vitally important for the European Union and the United States to continue claim being the anchor of a rules-based international system that is governed by Western values of open markets, social economy, fairness. And I very much hope that this anchor of transatlantic cooperation will remain strong. Obviously, I don't expect many things to happen now before the presidential elections in the United States, but I hope that after November, we will have this restart, this transatlantic restart that I think is badly needed.
Thank you. And keeping an eye on the clock, David, back to you.
So first of all, Jillian, I want to thank those who've asked the questions and apologize to those who may have submitted questions but didn't get their questions answered. Secondly, I want to
Ladies and gentlemen, we are dealing with some technical difficulties. Just a moment, please. All right, well, we'll wait for David to maybe join us again, but Vice President Schinas, allow me to thank you as well on behalf of AJC for joining us and talking about the issues that our live audience certainly cares a lot about. So really thank you for your time and spending this hour with us. It's been completely a fascinating discussion.
Thank you for the hospitality, and a special thanks to David, who has been frozen temporarily on my screen, but I'm sure that will remain always close at heart in the months and years to come. Thank you all.
Thank you. I will tell him. I also want to thank our audience for joining us and showing your commitment to the topics discussed here today. In these unique times, while so many of us are separated from our family and friends, AJC is still bringing us together on the issues that matter. Please consider making a donation to AJC so we can offer you more programs like this one, and so we can continue our advocacy for Israel and the Jewish people around the world. Visit ajc.org/donate. Please join us for our next Advocacy Anywhere program tomorrow, June 30th at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on Race in America, the Faith Perspective, featuring the Archbishop of Washington, Wilton D. Gregory. Please stay safe and healthy. Thank you.